Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I really, honestly do appreciate you being with me. Our subscriptions continue to grow. We're up well over 7,000 now. The viewership continues to grow. Many of you tell me, hey, I'm sharing, I'm sharing, I'm sharing. Well, keep it up, folks, because the word's getting out. And you can tell, you can tell by the panic, outright overt panic on the part of a growing number of futurists who feel that, boy, they've got to address this problem of preterism because it's just growing by leaps and bounds and it's infiltrating church after church after church. Well, that's right. Truth has a way of doing that. So it's really kind of cool. Okay, so help our channel grow. Would you do that? Like, subscribe, whatever you have to do. All right. So we're continuing our summary of what we have seen in our earlier lengthy study of the Olivet Discourse. And as I mentioned yesterday, we're focusing now on what we saw in regard to Matthew 24, verse 31. And well, I could summarize a whole bunch. As I mentioned, I only want to hit three or four main points that we have looked at earlier to drive these points home. Now, yesterday I talked about the fact that Matthew 24, 30 and 31 is about the coming of the Son of Man and the significance of that terminology of the coming of the Son of Man, taken directly from Daniel chapter 7. Meaning it had to be fulfilled. Listen, unless you can prove that Jesus is giving a brand new prophecy about the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 24, or maybe chapter 10, 23, or Matthew 16, 27, or Matthew 6, 26, 64, unless you can prove that he's giving a different Son of Man prophecy than what is found in Daniel, then since Daniel's prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds is delimited to the days of the Roman Empire, guess what? That's what all of these passages dealing with the coming of the Son of Man are about. Now, watch the significance of this. One of the final courts of appeal, one of those, one of those passages that is considered to be, oh, this is an iron wall against preterism, or so we're told. And that's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Paul, writing to the church at Thessalonica, of course, said, now, brethren, we would not have you to be ignorant concerning those who have fallen asleep. And so he made the promise, and he says, this we say to you by the word of the Lord. Now, if you remember, Steve Gregg, as I have been reviewing his book, Why Not Full Preterism, Steve Gregg, in attempting to eliminate any connection between Matthew 24 and 25 and Thessalonians, says, well, we don't really know what Paul meant when he said, this we say to you by the word of the Lord. He might, Gregg admits, he might have been saying, I'm going to remind you of what Jesus said while he was here on earth, and that would take us back to Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31. But you see, Steve can't have that. Why? Well, because Steve admits that Matthew 24, 29 to 31 is typical Hebraic apocalyptic language and was referring to the Lord's coming and judgment of Israel in AD 70. So Steve knows that if he acknowledges that 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18 is simply the reiteration and Paul's version of Matthew 24 saying the same things, then his futurism is destroyed. So while he admits that it's possible that Paul's drawing from Matthew 24, he says, well, that's not very likely. And the reason he gives for that is, well, because the elements that are found in Matthew chapter 24 are kind of broad, generic, non-specific apocalyptic tenets, you know, coming on the clouds, uh, with the angels. He says that's kind of typical language that is not within itself very specific enough to tell us when it would happen. Well, you know, we have the Lord coming on the clouds in the Old Testament. And just because he came on the clouds, no, it doesn't tell you who he was going to come against. In Isaiah 19, it was against Egypt. In Isaiah chapter 29 to 31, it was against Assyria. In Psalms chapter 18, it was against Saul and his forces attempting to kill David. So, yeah, just because the terminology of coming on the clouds is used, it doesn't tell you when. It does tell us it's Yahweh. It does tell us it's God, because only God in Scripture rode on the clouds. Psalm 68, Psalms 104. So, in one small way, Greg is correct to say some of the elements of Matthew 24 are not specific. But he says it is ruled by the time statement of Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, where Jesus said, "Verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled." So Greg couples the language with the time statement and says, Matthew 24, AD 70. But then Greg comes to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and here's the kicker, all right? When you couple Thessalonians with the fact that Paul very well could have been, and by the way, I would say that probably the majority of scholars, I've never taken an actual count, but when you read the commentaries, okay, commenting on Paul's statement, "This we say to you by the word of the Lord," the majority of the commentators that I have read, and that's a bunch of them, say Paul is in fact drawing directly from Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31. Now, the lamentable fact here is that many of those commentators say, well, of course, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus was predicting his coming at the end of the world, end of time, and he was obviously wrong. That's how scholars deal with the text, supposedly deal with the text. So once again, most scholars admit that Paul is drawing on the Olivet Discourse. By the way, even Kenneth Gentry cites several scholars pointing out that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul's drawing on the Olivet Discourse. Wow. Okay, so if Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18 is in fact just simply reminding the brethren there about what Jesus said in his personal ministry, and what he is reminding them of is precisely what Jesus said in Matthew 24, 29 to 34, then of logical necessity, that means that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is talking about the same thing as Jesus in Matthew 24, which means Paul was talking about AD 70. So what do we have? Matthew chapter 24, coming of the Lord, coming of the Son of Man. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24, coming with the angels. 1 Thessalonians 4, coming with the angels. Matthew chapter 24, coming with a shout. 1 Thessalonians 4, coming with a shout. Matthew chapter 24, coming with the sound of the trumpet. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, coming with the sound of the trumpet. Matthew chapter 24, coming for the gathering of the saints. More on that later. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, coming for the gathering of the saints. Now, somebody show me the difference between those elements. Somebody show me where, Matthew 24, that's metaphoric. Yeah, that's hyperbolic. That's apocalyptic language. But in Thessalonians, no, that's got to be literal. Paul's talking about physical resurrection in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Because you see, it's argued Matthew chapter 24 has nothing to do with resurrection. I once took that position, but it's wrong. I found out it was wrong. So, Matthew chapter 24, this generation shall not pass until all of these things are fulfilled. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, twice, Paul says, this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, present tense, when Paul was writing, he talked about, let's see, what's he talking about? Oh, he's talking about, and to his generation. Contrary to some who say, well, Paul was talking about himself being alive when the Lord came. But we know he was not alive in AD 70, therefore he couldn't be talking about that. Well, he won't be alive at some imaginary end of time either. Right? And so we're told, well, Paul was using the we here in a royal we sense, in the impersonal sense. Well, here's the deal. When you look at how Paul in Thessalonians uses the personal pronoun we or us, it is invariably a very personal use of the pronouns. He doesn't use we in some vague, generic, and timeless sense. Look, he uses the personal pronoun many times in Thessalonians. And he never uses the, quote, royal or editorial we in some sense to refer to events and to people thousands and thousands of years away. So what does it mean? It means that when Paul was saying, we who are alive and remain until the parousia, he was talking about his contemporary generation. By the way, the journalistic, the works on grammar admit, and they teach, when the royal or editorial we and us is used, it normally, can there be an editorial or royal we that is in fact expansive? Could it simply be speaking of a group of people, as is sometimes argued? Well, Paul's talking about the church. That makes no nonsense. I should say it doesn't make good nonsense. It's really ludicrous. You would have Paul saying, the church will be alive at the coming of the Lord. Well, yeah. Who would say otherwise? Has anybody ever suggested that the church would die completely out before the day of the Lord? So, all the grammars, all the journalistic grammars say that when a writer or speaker uses the royal or editorial we, they are speaking of themselves and their contemporaries. That's the normal, the normal use of the editorial we. So if somebody wants to argue that Paul was using the editorial we in some broad, massively comprehensive manner and timeless manner, then you got to prove that he was using it in a manner outside of normal. So what does all this mean? It means that since Matthew chapter 24 has all of these constituent elements in it, coming the Son, coming the Lord, with the angels, with a shout, with the trumpet, pardon me, again, on the clouds to gather the elect, and the time statement. And you have those exact same precise terms, words, concepts, motifs in Thessalonians, and you have the identical time statements. Listen, in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, I have a chart showing 22, I think that's correct, 22 direct parallels between Paul's Thessalonian discourse, both in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and the Olivet Discourse. 22 direct parallels. Some of the parallels are very rare words. They're words that are used only by Jesus and only in the Olivet Discourse, and Paul uses them in Thessalonians. That's more than coincidental, don't you think? So the point this morning is Jesus talked about his coming on the clouds with the angels, with the clouds, with the shout, with the trumpet for the gathering. Apologize. Paul gave the identical elements, and the elements are not some vague generic ones, as Steve Gregg wants to claim. They're precise. So when you couple the elements with Paul's statement, this we say to you by the word of the Lord, when you couple that statement with we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord, folks, you have perfect parallelism, and it's inescapable. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 was fulfilled in AD 70. I'll see you on the flip side.